I always knew something was off about Linda. From the moment my father introduced her as his new wife, there was something calculated about the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she always made herself the center of attention. But my father, Richard Carter, the brilliant but stubborn founder of Carter Tech, was completely blind to it. Maybe he was lonely after my mother passed away. Maybe he just wanted to believe in love again. Either way, he brought her into our lives without hesitation, and from that moment on, everything changed. Linda didn't come alone. She had a son, Ethan. A guy with the charm of a used car salesman and the work ethic of a houseplant. He was the kind of person who always had an excuse, always had a way to weasel out of responsibility. Yet somehow, my father saw potential in him. "David," he would say whenever I tried to point out Ethan's laziness, "not everyone is like you. Some people just need a little guidance." Guidance? Ethan wasn't looking for guidance. He was looking for a free ride. And Linda made sure he got it. Over the years, I watched as she slowly tightened her grip on my father's life. First, it was little things, convincing him to redecorate the house to her taste, nudging him into vacations that conveniently kept me away from important company meetings. Then it was bigger things, pushing him to give Ethan a position at Carter Tech, despite his complete lack of qualifications. "He just needs experience," she'd say, flashing that sweet but empty smile. And my father, against all logic, agreed. Meanwhile, I did everything I could to prove myself. I worked twice as hard, stayed late at the office, handled major deals, and built relationships with our top clients. I was the one making Carter Tech stronger, ensuring its future. But no matter what I did, I was always second to the family my father had chosen to prioritize. Then came the worst day of my life. It happened so suddenly. A heart attack. My father was gone before the ambulance even arrived. One minute he was planning the next phase of Carter Tech's expansion, and the next, he was just gone. I barely had time to grieve before Linda took control. While I was still trying to process losing my father, she was already making calls, setting meetings, ensuring everything was in place. It should have been a red flag, but I was too lost in my own pain to see it. And then came the reading of the will. I walked into the lawyer's office that morning, thinking I knew what to expect. My father wasn't a cruel man. He built Carter Tech from the ground up, and I had spent my whole life working alongside him, preparing to one day lead the company. It was common sense. I was his son, his natural successor. Whatever else he left to Linda and Ethan, Carter Tech would be mine. But as I sat there, listening to the lawyer read out the terms, my stomach twisted into knots. "To my beloved wife, Linda Carter, and her son, Ethan Carter, I leave Carter Tech and all associated assets, including but not limited to." The words blurred together. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. This had to be a mistake. The lawyer kept reading, but I could barely focus. When he finally got to my name, I sat up straight, waiting. Waiting for the part where everything would be made right. Waiting for the part where my father acknowledged everything I had done. "To my son, David Carter, I leave my personal watch, which was given to me by my father and has always been a symbol of hard work and dedication." A watch. A goddamn watch. I felt cold. Numb. I looked at Linda, at Ethan. Linda had the decency to put on a sad face, like she was heartbroken for me. But Ethan? Ethan smirked. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, like he had just won the lottery. And in a way, he had. I clenched my fists so tightly, my nails dug into my palms. My father had left me with nothing. Nothing except an old, worn-out watch and the bitter taste of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rip that smug look off Ethan's face. But instead, I forced myself to stay silent. Because in that moment, one thing became painfully clear: arguing wouldn't change a damn thing. The damage was done. My father had made his choice. And now, it was my turn to make mine. Have you ever felt completely blindsided by someone you trusted? Comment 111 if you know that pain. Growing up, I learned that betrayal doesn't always come with a dramatic revelation. Sometimes, it happens slowly, so slowly that you don't even realize it until it's too late. That was how Linda took over my life, one small shift at a time. At first, she seemed harmless. My father met her at a charity gala, introduced her to me with that wide grin of his, like a schoolboy smitten for the first time. "David, this is Linda," he said, beaming. "She's wonderful." I remember shaking her hand, her grip delicate but firm. She had the kind of presence that filled a room, not loud, not overwhelming, but carefully calculated. I wanted to be happy for my father. After losing my mother, he had been a shadow of himself, throwing himself into work as a distraction from the grief. I thought maybe this woman could bring some light back into his life. And for a while, she did. She was attentive, caring, and effortlessly charming. She laughed at all my father's jokes, even the bad ones. She acted like she adored me, asking about my work, my dreams, making me believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be good for our family. I should have known better. Little things started changing. At first, it was barely noticeable. My father and I had a tradition. Every Sunday morning, we'd sit at the kitchen table with black coffee and the newspaper, talking business. Even when I was a kid, he used to explain market trends to me like I was his equal. It was our time. But after Linda moved in, those Sundays disappeared. One morning, I came downstairs, expecting to see him in his usual seat. Instead, I found Linda at the kitchen counter, flipping through a glossy magazine, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. "Oh, Richard already ate," she said, flashing that warm smile of hers. "I made him a smoothie. It's healthier." I forced a polite nod and sat down, waiting for him to come out of his office. He never did. That was how it started, small, insignificant changes that I shrugged off, convincing myself I was imagining things. But the distance between my father and me only grew. The man who once called me his right hand, his protégé, was suddenly too busy for long talks, too distracted to listen when I told him about a new project at Carter Tech. And then there was Ethan. He was everything I wasn't. While I spent years working my way up in my father's company, starting from the bottom, proving myself in every department, Ethan walked in and was immediately given a cushy position in management. No experience, no qualifications. Just a last name and a mother who knew exactly how to manipulate my father. At first, I tried to be civil. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe he would put in the effort. But Ethan had no interest in working. He was more focused on making connections with the right people, which, in his mind, meant networking at expensive clubs and hosting lavish parties on my father's dime. One evening, I stayed late at the office, finishing a report my father had asked for. As I walked past the conference room, I heard laughter, Ethan's voice, loud and arrogant. Curious, I stepped closer and peeked inside. There he was, lounging back in a chair, feet propped up on the table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I don't need to know all that technical stuff," he was saying to one of his equally useless friends. "As long as I play my cards right, the old man will hand everything over to me anyway." My stomach twisted in disgust. I clenched my fists, debating whether to walk in and call him out. But I didn't. I already knew how that conversation would go. So instead, I went to my father. "Dad," I said one night over dinner, "I don't think Ethan is serious about the company." He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the topic exhausted him. "David, give him time. He's young. He's 25. My father set his fork down. "He just needs guidance." I felt frustration boil in my chest. I'd been guiding him. I'd been doing my best to help him, but he doesn't care. He treats this like a game while I stopped myself, swallowing the lump in my throat. My father's expression softened. "David," he said quietly, "you've always been strong. Independent. You don't need me the way Ethan does." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't need him? Was that why he was pulling away? Because I didn't need him enough? I should have told him then. I should have said, "No, Dad. I do need you. I need you to see me. I need you to trust me." But I didn't. I just nodded, forcing myself to swallow my pride. Because I was still his son. Because I still believed, deep down, that when the time came, he would do the right thing. I was wrong. The day my father's will was read, I sat in that lawyer's office, feeling like a fool. Linda was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Ethan was sitting back with that smug look on his face, and I was waiting. Waiting for my father's voice to be heard through that piece of paper. But instead of the validation I had spent my whole life chasing, I got a single sentence. To my son, David Carter, I leave my personal watch, which was given to me by my father and has always been a symbol of hard work and dedication. I gripped the arms of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white. A watch. That was what my father thought of me? A symbol? I looked at Linda, at Ethan. Linda had the nerve to look sad for me, like she hadn't been the one whispering in my father's ear for years, turning him against me piece by piece. And Ethan? Ethan smirked. That same arrogant, entitled smirk I had seen so many times before. It was in that moment that I realized something painful but necessary. It was never about who deserved what. It was never about fairness or hard work. My father hadn't chosen Ethan because he was worthy. He had chosen him because Linda had made sure of it. Because I had been too strong, too independent, too capable, and in the end, that had cost me everything. But if they thought they had won, they were wrong. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I would take back what was mine. Because I had spent my whole life proving myself, and I wasn't about to stop now. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone, only to realize it meant nothing? Comment 222 if you know that pain. I walked out of that lawyer's office, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over again, my father would see me, would recognize that I was the rightful heir to Carter Tech. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. My loyalty, my dedication, my sacrifices, they had all meant nothing. Linda and Ethan had won. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I wouldn't let them see the anger raging inside me, the betrayal burning through my veins. They wanted me to lash out, to cause a scene, to look like the ungrateful son who couldn't accept his father's wishes. But I wouldn't give them that power. Instead, I turned to the lawyer and asked, in the steadiest voice I could manage, "When do I need to vacate my office?" He hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "Effective immediately." Linda let out a soft, artificial sigh, as if she was actually sad about it. "David, honey, this doesn't mean we don't value you. Ethan and I didn't let her finish. I turned and walked out the door, leaving behind the last remnants of the life I had built. The drive back to Carter Tech was the longest one of my life. The city blurred past me in streaks of gray and gold, but all I could hear was Ethan's voice in my head. "You don't need me the way Ethan does." That's what my father had said. That was his excuse. He thought I was too strong, too independent. But in reality, I had just been too blind. When I arrived at the office, I stepped into the building for what I knew would be the last time as its rightful owner. The receptionist, someone who had been with the company since its early days, gave me a sad, knowing look, but said nothing. Word had already spread. By the time I reached my office, Ethan was already sitting in my chair. My chair. He had his feet propped up on the desk, a smug grin on his face, like a king surveying his new kingdom. "David," he greeted, stretching out my name like we were old friends. "Took you long enough. Guess it's gonna take some time to get used to not being the one in charge, huh?" I didn't answer. I simply walked to my desk, grabbed a box from the corner, and began packing my things. The framed photo of my father and me at a Carter Tech launch event. My collection of business journals. The leather notebook where I had sketched out new expansion plans that would never come to fruition under Ethan's leadership. He watched me, amused. You know, he continued, you really should be happy for me. I mean, you had your chance. 30 years, right? And now, it's my turn. I paused, gripping the edge of my desk. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to respond, to tear him apart, to remind him that the only reason he was in that chair was because of his mother's scheming. That he had done nothing to earn it. That he would destroy everything my father built. But I forced myself to breathe. To push down the rage. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this: Ethan would fail. The moment Linda wasn't there to prop him up, the moment he actually had to make a real decision, he would crumble. And when that happened, I would be ready. So instead of giving him the fight he wanted, I simply smiled. A slow, knowing smile. The kind that told him he wasn't half as powerful as he thought he was. Enjoy it while it lasts, Ethan, I said, my voice steady. Because it won't last long. His smirk faltered, just for a second. And that was enough. I picked up my box and walked out, leaving Carter Tech behind. For now. For the first time in my life, I had no plan. I had spent decades preparing to lead Carter Tech, dedicating my life to it, sacrificing relationships, friendships, even my own happiness for the sake of the company. And now, without it, I felt untethered. Like I was floating in open water, with no land in sight. I spent days holed up in my apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, replaying everything in my mind. My father's words. The look on Ethan's face. The betrayal that still sat like a stone in my chest. And then, one night, as I sat on my couch staring at the unopened box of my father's belongings, something shifted inside me. I realized something. I had spent my whole life waiting for my father's approval. Waiting for him to see me, to validate me, to tell me that I was enough. But he never did. And now, he never would. So what the hell was I waiting for? I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to wallow in self-pity. I was going to take back what was mine. Not through anger. Not through reckless decisions. But through strategy. Through patience. Through calculated vengeance. I grabbed my laptop and started making calls. If Ethan thought he could erase me from Carter Tech, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. If my father thought I didn't need him, then I was about to prove that he was right. Because I would build something better. Stronger. And when the dust settled, there would be no question who the real Carter Tech heir was. What would you do if someone took everything from you? Comment 333 if you'd fight to take it back. I didn't leave that office broken. I didn't leave defeated. I left watching. Observing. Calculating. Ethan and Linda thought they had won, that they had erased me from the world my father built. But they had no idea. The best kind of revenge isn't loud. It isn't messy. It's silent. It's patient. And when it finally hits, it's unstoppable. So I did what they least expected. I disappeared. Not literally, of course. I was still in the city, still moving through the same circles. But I stayed out of sight, out of the headlines, out of their minds. I became a ghost in their world. And while they celebrated, while they basked in their ill-gotten victory, I was laying the foundation for something much, much bigger. The first step? Cutting off their lifeline. Carter Tech didn't become a powerhouse overnight. It was built on relationships, loyal partnerships my father had cultivated for years. People trusted him. Not the name. Not the flashy branding. Him. And for a long time, they trusted me too. Linda had always treated these relationships like an afterthought, a tool to be used. Ethan? He barely understood the importance of maintaining them. To him, Carter Tech was a personal playground, not a business requiring real leadership. That was my advantage. I started making quiet calls, reaching out to old contacts, investors, suppliers, and longtime clients. People who had worked with my father, people who had trusted me before Linda and Ethan shoved me out. I didn't ask for anything outright. Not yet. Instead, I listened. I heard the hesitation in their voices. The uncertainty. Ethan had been in charge for only a few months, and already, things were changing. Deliveries were delayed. Customer service had slipped. High-level executives were leaving. Doubt was creeping in. And I was there to fuel it. It's a shame, I told them, my voice laced with just the right amount of disappointment. Carter Tech used to be run with integrity. My father always put his partners first. But I suppose things are different now. I never spoke badly about Ethan directly. I didn't need to. Doubt is a powerful thing. Plant the seed, and it grows on its own. Step 2? Assembling the right people. I didn't have a company. Not yet. But I had an idea. I knew how Carter Tech worked, what made it successful, what kept it running. And I knew one simple truth: no company survives without the right people. So I started making a different set of calls. Not to investors. Not to clients. To the people who actually made Carter Tech work. I knew exactly who to target. The ones who had been overlooked, underappreciated. The ones Ethan dismissed because he was too arrogant to see their worth. The first person I called was Mark Roberts, the head of Carter Tech's research and development. He had been with the company for 20 years, longer than anyone except my father. Mark was a genius, the kind of mind that turned ideas into billion-dollar innovations. But Ethan? He treated Mark like an old relic, like a disposable asset. "David," Mark said when I called. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I told him the truth. I'm starting something new. Something built on loyalty. On trust. No corporate games, no power-hungry executives playing chess with people's careers. Just real work. Real innovation. And I need you. He didn't hesitate. I'm in. And just like that, I had my first piece. It didn't stop there. One by one, I reached out to the best minds at Carter Tech, the ones who made the company what it was. The ones Ethan and Linda thought they could replace. One by one, they left. Ethan was too distracted, too busy playing CEO to notice at first. But by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. His best people were gone. And they weren't just leaving for any company. They were coming to me. Step 3? The final stroke of genius. I didn't just want to compete with Carter Tech. I wanted to eclipse it. To create something so powerful, so undeniable, that when Carter Tech inevitably fell, there would be no doubt about who had orchestrated its demise. I needed a name. A brand that meant something. Carter Tech had always been synonymous with my father's legacy. Ethan thought he had stolen that legacy for himself. He was wrong. Because I wasn't just David Carter, the son of Richard Carter. I was David Carter, the future. And so, Carter Innovations was born. A direct challenge to everything Ethan thought he had taken from me. I built my company in the shadows while he continued his reign of incompetence. He didn't even see the storm coming. By the time Carter Innovations officially launched, we already had clients lined up, investors backing us, and a workforce of the best minds in the industry. I didn't announce it with fanfare. I didn't need to. The moment Carter Innovations became public knowledge, the panic inside Carter Tech began. Ethan called an emergency board meeting. He scrambled, trying to assure his investors that the company was still strong. But behind closed doors? I knew he was terrified. And that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. Because taking away a company wasn't enough. I wanted to take away his confidence. His pride. I wanted to watch him fall. And when he did? I wanted him to know exactly who had orchestrated his downfall. Have you ever had to stay silent while planning your next move? Comment 444 if you know that feeling. A year ago, I walked out of Carter Tech with nothing but a box of my belongings and the seething fire of betrayal burning inside me. Today, I walked into the office of Carter Innovations, the company I built, the empire I created, knowing that my revenge was complete. I had spent every waking moment of the past 12 months strategizing, executing, and watching as Ethan and Linda stumbled into the very trap they had set for me. They had thought I would fade into the background, disappear like an afterthought. But I had done the opposite. I had sharpened my skills, gathered my forces, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. And it worked. Carter Innovations wasn't just another tech company, it was the tech company. The moment we launched, clients, many of them longtime Carter Tech partners, began shifting their business to us. Investors followed, drawn by our innovations, our efficiency, our reliability. Everything Carter Tech had once stood for under my father's leadership, we now embodied. Meanwhile, Ethan, in all his arrogance, had assumed his last name alone would be enough to sustain Carter Tech. He had underestimated just how deep the loyalty to my father ran, and how little respect anyone had for him. The cracks in Carter Tech's foundation appeared faster than I expected. Within 6 months, they were losing major accounts. Within 10, their stock had taken a devastating hit. And now, at exactly the 1-year mark, Carter Tech was in free fall. And Ethan? He was drowning. The fall of Carter Tech. It started small. An investor pulling out here, a major supplier shifting there. The board began asking questions Ethan couldn't answer. He was used to having things handed to him, but leadership? Problem solving? That wasn't in his DNA. Then came the real blows. One by one, the biggest clients walked away. Carter Tech had built itself on trust, and trust wasn't something Ethan knew how to maintain. Companies weren't willing to risk millions on an incompetent CEO who had inherited his position through nepotism. When the first major contract went to Carter Innovations, I knew I had won. But I wasn't satisfied with just winning. I wanted to watch them lose. And I did. The moment Carter Tech announced massive layoffs, I knew Ethan had lost control. He tried to spin it as a necessary restructuring, but people weren't stupid. They knew the company was sinking. The press turned on him, and the headlines practically wrote themselves. From powerhouse to downfall, Carter Tech's collapse under new leadership. Carter Tech faces financial crisis. Did the wrong Carter take over? David Carter's new venture soars while Carter Tech crumbles. That last one? That one was my favorite. Ethan tried everything, cutting costs, scrambling to hold on to investors, begging his board to give him more time. But time wasn't on his side. And neither was I. The desperate plea. I was in my office when my assistant knocked on my door. "Sir," she said, hesitating slightly. "Linda Carter is here." "And Ethan." I almost laughed. Almost. "Send them in," I said, leaning back in my chair. The door opened, and there they were. The same two people who had stolen my legacy, who had humiliated me and cast me aside as if I were nothing. But now? Now the power had shifted. Linda looked different, older, weaker, desperate. Her polished, calculated demeanor was gone, replaced with something frantic. Ethan, on the other hand, looked exactly the same, except the smugness was wiped from his face. "David," Linda started, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." I raised an eyebrow, gesturing to the chairs across from me. "Go ahead." She sat down, her hands clasped together like she was praying for mercy. "Carter Tech is struggling," she admitted, as if that wasn't already public knowledge. "We need help." I stayed silent, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Ethan, unable to bear the silence, finally spoke. "David, look, I know we've had our differences." I bit back a smirk. "Differences? That's what he called stealing my birthright?" "But Carter Tech is still your father's company," he continued, his voice betraying his frustration. "If you help us, we can rebuild." We can fix this. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Fix this? I repeated, tilting my head. You mean I can fix your mess? Linda let out a shaky breath. David, please. You're the only one who can save your father's legacy. I stared at her. At both of them. And for a moment, I thought about it. Not because I had any intention of helping them, but because I wanted to savor this moment. I remembered the way Ethan had smirked at me the day he took over. The way Linda had pretended to be sympathetic while she signed away everything my father built. I remembered every condescending word, every smug expression, every cruel betrayal. I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket as I walked around the desk. Then, with deliberate ease, I leaned in just slightly and looked Linda right in the eyes. Linda, I said smoothly, I think you're mistaken about something. She blinked. What do you mean? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You said I should save my father's legacy. I gestured to the windows behind me, where Carter Innovations stood tall, thriving. I already did. Ethan tensed. David. I turned to him, cutting him off with nothing more than a look. Carter Tech isn't my father's company anymore, I said evenly. It's yours. Or at least, it was. I took a step back, letting my words sink in. And from where I'm standing, I'd say you did a hell of a job running it into the ground. Linda's lower lip trembled. Ethan clenched his jaw. They knew. They knew I wasn't going to save them. I gave them one last look, memorizing their faces, the desperation, the realization, the humiliation. Then I turned, walked to the door, and opened it. This meeting is over. Neither of them moved. So I looked over my shoulder, raising an eyebrow. Unless you'd like my assistant to escort you out? Linda stood first, swallowing hard as she smoothed down her jacket. She didn't look at me. Ethan, however, glared as he got to his feet. This isn't over, he muttered. I laughed, genuinely laughed. Ethan, it was over the day you thought you could take what was mine. They left without another word. And as the door shut behind them, I felt nothing but satisfaction. Carter Tech was finished. And I was just getting started. Do you think they got what they deserved? Comment 555 if you believe justice was served. When the door shut behind Ethan and Linda that day, I expected to feel something more, some final wave of triumph, a rush of vindication that would wash away every wound they had inflicted on me. And for a moment, I did. Watching them walk out of my office, powerless and defeated, was the moment I had been waiting for. I had fought for this, planned for this, and executed it flawlessly. But as I stood there in the silence that followed, something unexpected settled inside me. Relief. Not the kind that comes from revenge or winning a battle, but the kind that comes when you finally let something go. For years, I had lived in the shadow of my father's expectations, in the bitterness of his final betrayal, in the rage that had fueled my rise. Every decision I made, every calculated move, had been driven by the need to prove something, to him, to Linda, to Ethan, and maybe even to myself. And now, for the first time, I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. A new chapter begins. Carter Innovations flourished beyond even my own expectations. We weren't just a competitor to Carter Tech anymore, we had become the standard in the industry. The best minds worked for us, the most valuable partnerships aligned with us, and the world was beginning to recognize that the name Carter no longer belonged to a failing dynasty, but to something new, something better. Investors who had once hesitated now fought to be part of our success. We expanded globally, launching cutting-edge projects that put us leagues ahead of the competition. I built something that wasn't just a response to my father's company, it was mine. It carried my vision, my leadership, my mark on the world. And Ethan? He never recovered. After the collapse of Carter Tech, he tried, desperately, to cling to whatever scraps of wealth and status he had left. But the business world doesn't forgive failure easily, especially when that failure comes from arrogance and incompetence. The last I heard, he had burned through what remained of his inheritance and was desperately trying to start over. But no one was willing to bet on a man who had already proven himself unworthy. Linda? She disappeared from the business world entirely. The name that once carried influence and power had been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in corporate cautionary tales. The woman who had spent years manipulating my father, scheming her way into his empire, was now just another cautionary story of greed gone wrong. But I no longer wasted my time thinking about them. For so long, my life had been about reclaiming what was taken from me, but now that I had it, I realized something even more important: I didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. Healing the wounds. Even as I built my empire, even as success surrounded me, I couldn't ignore the emptiness that still lingered in the quieter moments. I had won, yes, but victory didn't erase the scars. The betrayal of my father still lived inside me. The loss of the man I once admired, the unanswered questions, the finality of knowing I would never hear him say, "I was wrong. You were always enough." There was no going back to fix what had been broken. There was no apology coming. And so, I had to let it go. It took time. More time than I expected. I traveled, something I hadn't done in years. Not for business, not for networking, but for myself. I went to places where no one knew my name, where I wasn't David Carter, the son of Richard Carter, or David Carter, the CEO of Carter Innovations. I was just David. I spent weeks in small towns, in quiet cafes, in places that had nothing to do with the corporate world I had been raised in. I met people who lived simply, who measured success not in wealth or power, but in moments, in laughter, in time spent with family, in the freedom of living on their own terms. And for the first time, I asked myself, what does success mean to me? Redefining success. I used to think success was power, control, winning. But now, I started to see it differently. It was about peace. About choice. About waking up in the morning and knowing that I was living a life that belonged to me, not to someone else's expectations or legacy. It didn't mean I stopped building Carter Innovations. I loved what I had created, and I was proud of it. But I also realized that success wasn't just about the empire, I needed something more. So I started to focus on things I had once ignored. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I had pushed aside in my pursuit of proving myself. Some welcomed me back instantly. Others took time. I didn't blame them. I had spent so long focused on one goal that I had let so much else slip away. I also started something new, mentorship. For years, I had fought to be seen, to be given the opportunities one deserved. Now, I had the power to make sure others didn't have to fight the same way. I launched initiatives to help young entrepreneurs, to guide those with talent but without connections, to level the playing field so that success wasn't just reserved for those with the right last name. I built something that wasn't just about me. It was about change. The final goodbye. One evening, nearly 2 years after I walked away from Carter Tech for the last time, I found myself back at my father's grave. I hadn't visited since the funeral. Not because I didn't care, but because I hadn't been ready. I stood there for a long time, watching the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the name etched in stone. Richard Carter. For so long, I had been angry at him. And maybe a part of me always would be. But standing there, I also realized something else. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had spent my whole life chasing something that was never mine to begin with. But I didn't need it. Not anymore. I had built something greater. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't living in his shadow. I turned to leave, feeling lighter than I ever had before. Some battles are fought for revenge. Others are fought for justice. But the most important battles? The ones that truly define you? They're the ones you fight for yourself. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from nothing? Share your story in the comments below. There was a time when I believed my worth was tied to other people's validation. That if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, and remained loyal enough, I would be recognized. that I would finally be enough. But the truth is, some people will never see your value, because they don't want to. Because it's easier for them to take from you than to acknowledge you. For years, I let my father's approval define me. I let his choices, his blind loyalty to the wrong people, dictate the course of my life. When he left everything to Ethan, when Linda and her son took over the empire I had helped build, I thought I had lost everything. But what I learned in the aftermath of that betrayal was this: losing everything can sometimes be the best thing that ever happens to you. It forces you to start over, not just in your career, but within yourself. It forces you to see who you are when everything you once relied on is gone. And it gives you the chance to take back control, not by seeking revenge, but by reclaiming your own power. I didn't win by tearing them down. I won by rising above them. I built something greater, something that was mine. And in doing so, I found something even more valuable than success: freedom. The biggest lesson I learned from all of this? No one gets to decide your worth but you. Not your family. Not your employer. Not the people who underestimate you or try to keep you small. No one. If someone takes what is rightfully yours, if someone betrays you, you don't have to stay and fight on their terms. You don't have to prove yourself to people who refuse to see you. Instead, you walk away, and you build something better. And yes, it will hurt. Yes, it will feel unfair. But in the end, what matters is that you reclaim your own life. That you refuse to let someone else's decisions define you. That you choose yourself. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing, know this: you are stronger than you think. You are capable of more than you believe. And you don't need anyone's permission to take back what is yours. So tell me, have you ever had to fight to reclaim your power? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect yourself? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Because no one should ever have to question their worth. And sometimes, the best way to win is simply to choose yourself.